Well, good afternoon, folks. Welcome back to 3 Zen. This afternoon, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Don Ross. I had mentioned him in an earlier video in reference to Joe, and so today I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Don. Don was our section commander. I was when I was at Vance Air Force Base. I was the O-Flight commander, and I worked directly for Don, as it turned out. And I enjoyed working for him. He and I both shared the same mindset with respect to training and how to fly the jet and so forth. It turns out that Don had graduated from Bowling Green State University in 1963, and then I rolled into BG in 1964. And then we met each other at Vance, subsequently met each other at Vance and became good friends. We had an occasion where a class graduated and one of the students went to Holloman Air Force Base to fighter lead-in. He had received an F4 and was taking fighter lead-in when he walked in one morning and quit. Now that's almost virtually unheard of, but this kid decided it wasn't for him. And when asked why he was quitting, he said he didn't realize that fighters killed people. You gotta be kidding me. Anyway, our wing commander at that time, James Smotherman, mandated that the section commanders come around to each flight and tell the kids how the cow eats the cabbage. So this one morning, Don walks into our flight and he starts out by asking a few students, why did you come to pilot training? Why do you think you want to be a pilot? And this one kid raises his hand and says, well, I've always enjoyed watching the birds fly, and I thought that'd be kind of neat. Give me a break. Anyway, this other kid raises his hand and says, well, my dad's a pilot, and he says, that's kind of what I'd like to do, to follow in his footsteps. And another kid had another reason. Well, pilots make a lot of money on the outside, yada, 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 and so forth. So Don let him go a little bit, and then he said, I want to tell you something. He says, you need to think about this. And he says, you are in Air Force pilot training for one and only one reason, to become the air assassins of the United States Air Force. And that's it. That's your sole job. Whether you end up flying T-38s, C-141s, F-4s, B-52s, whatever. Your mission is to become the air assassins of the United States government. And he said, I can't think of a more rewarding job than that, but it's not for everybody. So he said, you need to think long and hard about it before you continue. And he said, if you have any objections, then I suggest you SIQ. Well, we had this program in pilot training called SIE, which was self-initiated elimination. And Don throws out SIQ. And of course, there's some kid in the back or whatever that raises a hand, sir, what's SIQ? And Don, without skipping a beat, looks at him. He says, that's shit, I quit. Well, right then and there, our friendship just solidified. I mean, I'm on the same page as Don. So over the next few months, we had contact with each other, probably on a daily basis with regard to student training and so forth. Then this one day he came up to me and he says, Bob, he says, I've got to go up to Wright-Patterson. He says, my mom's not feeling real well. And he said, there's a chance I might have to declare emergency leave when I get there. And you'll have to bring the jet back solo. Oh, dang. Well, okay. So we hopped in the jet and we took off. And somewhere over Kansas City, I remember this distinctly, he said to me, Bob, he said, how would you like to come to work for me up in Flight Safety Division? At that time, Don had left the squadron as a section commander and had become the chief of safety at Vance. So I sat there for a moment. It was a sunny day. And I sat there for a moment and I said, Don, I said, how would you like to kiss my ass? And then it got real quiet. Not a thing was said. And I thought to myself, oh, good Lord, Bob, why'd you do that? I mean, Don's a good man. He's a major, he outranks you. I mean, can't you show respect for the rank? And besides, didn't deserve that kind of a reply. So I'm sitting back there in the back seat, beating myself up, and then Don comes over the intercom. He says, well, after careful consideration, Bob, he says, I think I'd rather have you come to work for me in safety. Oh, good. Oh, man. So I just let it go. But eventually I did talk with him more about that, and eventually went to work for him in flight safety. And that was probably one of the better moves I made in my Air Force career. Don had talked to the wing commander at that time and said, listen, I've got this guy as a flight commander. I'd like to bring him up to wing safety. We're trying to dial up the image of flight safety, the credibility, and so forth. And I think Bob would help us do that with respect to the relationship he has with the troops in the squadron. And I'd been in the squadron for 2 years at that time, so I literally jumped at the chance to go work for him, and it turned out to be a pretty good deal for me. We took a couple more trips when we were stationed together, working together. One of them was out to Oregon to visit some relatives of mine. So we're flying along the northern border. We'd gone the northern route, and so we're kind of parallel in Canada. It's kind of quiet up there, and Don says, hey, Bob, he says, you realize we're only 50 miles from the Canadian border? And I said, well, I suppose so. I haven't given it much thought. And he says, got any inkling to defect? He said, this would be a great time for it. I thought, no, I don't want to defect. But that was just his kind of sense of humor. Don eventually left Vance and went to Germany in the OV-10, and then I went to Randolph and then down to Australia. But we kept in touch. I always enjoyed his counsel. I enjoyed his wisdom, for sure. And then when he came back to the United States, he retired from the, after another tour, I think at Tyndall, he retired from the Air Force and then moved first to Tennessee, and then he moved up to New York. I might have those transposed, but it doesn't make any difference. At one point, I think I do. At one point, he went back to school and became a Lutheran minister. He became a teaching minister as opposed to a preaching minister. He has a doctorate in theology. And he became a dean at the Concordia College there in Bronxville, New York. As such, he picked up the moniker Dean Rambo. When he'd get a new class of students in, he'd take a moment to welcome them, and then during the welcoming process, he would at some point come out with, in my before life, he would say, I used to kill people for a living, and there's some days I miss it. So these students named him Dean Rambo. Anyway, I caught up with him when he was in New York, when I began flying for Northwest Airlines in 1989. And one night we met for dinner in the city. I had a long layover. So I called him and Rosalie, his wife, and I said, hey, how'd you guys like to meet me for dinner? And they graciously agreed. So we met at a Italian place. And really, really a great visit. But while we're sitting there eating, Don happened to mention he was going to China. And I said, okay, that's pretty interesting. What are you going to China for? And he says, I'm the chaperone for, I think he said 29 of the students that he's taken over there for study for 4 to 6 weeks, something like that. I don't know what it was. So I said, and what exactly are your duties as the chaperone? Now, Rosalie was rather quiet. She was polite, but she was really quiet. You rarely knew she was in the room. at any given time. And then in later years, as I came to know her, I discovered she was one funny lady. But anyway, at this time, I didn't know her that well. And she's sitting over there eating while Don and I are kind of talking to each other. So I asked Don again, I said, so what are your duties exactly as the chaperone? And without looking up, without skipping a beat, Rosalie says, his job's to keep the kids from screwing each other. And I looked at her and I about fell off the chair. For that statement to come out of her mouth just about blew me away. So as I'm sitting there trying to take all this in, Don, in his typical demeanor, sitting there contemplating. And then he looks up at me and he says, yeah, he says, that'd be about right. And I just shook my head. It was just so typical. But at any rate, in later years, when I found my way into sobriety, Don was there for me, and he never missed an opportunity. When I called and needed to talk to someone, Don was always there. And his counsel was very well received, if you will. I will always be grateful that Don Ross walked into my life. And I would think of him with a great deal of respect. Always have a smile when I think of him. And I know I'm a better person for having met him and gotten to know him. So Don, thank you for walking into my life and being a good friend. Take care.